Welcome to The Book of Life, a show about Jewish books, music, film, and web. I'm Heidi Aston. Lily Koppel's book, The Red Leather Diary, combines the writings of a teenager named Florence Wolfson with the memories of the same woman at the age of 90. Lily explains how she found first the diary and then Florence herself in a talk at Aston Garden Senior Living Center in Parkland, Florida, sponsored by the Parkland Library and the Ann Slater Memorial Fund. This podcast is part 1 of 2 in our Red Leather Diary series, and it's a recording of Lily's presentation. Part 2 will be podcasted separately, and that will be an interview I did with Lily after her talk.
Well, good evening. So wonderful to be here. Just flew in from New York. It was chilly. We had that foot of snow. So, let's see. I might perch up here. How's that? Can everyone see me? Okay. Well, I just want to thank you all for coming here. The Red Leather Diary is really a fairy tale, but it's not a novel. It's true. And it happened to me, and I'm going to begin by reading from the book and then telling you how I entered into this magical story. Once upon a time, the diary had a tiny key. Little red flakes now crumble off the worn cover. For more than half a century, its tarnished latch unlocked, the red leather diary lay silent inside an old steamer trunk strewn with vintage labels evoking the glamorous age of ocean liner travel. This book belongs to, reads the frontispiece, followed by Florence Wolfson, scrawled in faded black ink. Inside, in brief, breathless dispatches written on gold-edged pages, the journal recorded 5 years in the life and times of a smart and headstrong New York teenager, a young woman who loved Baudelaire, Central Park, and men and women with equal abandon. Tucked within the diary, like a pressed flower, is a yellowed newspaper clipping. The photograph of a girl with huge, soulful eyes and marcelled blonde hair atop a heart-shaped face stares out of the brittle scrap. The diary was a gift for her 14th birthday on August 11, 1929, and she wrote a few lines faithfully every day until she turned 19. Then, like so many relics of time past, it was forgotten. The trunk in turn languished in the basement of 98 Riverside Drive, a pre-war apartment house at 82nd Street, until October 2003, when the management decided it was time to clear out the storage area. The trunk was one of a roomful carted to a waiting dumpster, and is often the case in New York. Trash and treasure were bedfellows. Some passers-by jimmied open the locks and pried apart the trunk's sides in search of old money. Others stared transfixed, as if gazing into a shipwreck, at the treasures spilling from the warped cedar drawers. A flowered kimono, a beaded flapper dress, a cloth-bound volume of Tennyson's poems, half of a baby's red sweater still hanging from its knitting needles. A single limp silk glove fluttered like a small flag. But the diary seems a particularly eloquent survivor of another age. It was as if a corsage once pinned to a girl's dress were preserved for 3/4 of a century, faded ribbons intact, the scent still lingering on its petals. Through a serendipitous chain of events, the diary was given the chance to tell its story. Now here's where I enter into the picture. I grew up in Chicago, in Hyde Park, which you've heard about. It's Obama's neighborhood, or was his neighborhood. I moved to New York to go to college at Barnard. And by the time I graduated, I was about halfway through a novel. And I had an utterly romantic notion of what being a writer was all about. And I probably still do. But I figured I would finish the book, somehow afford a small apartment, break into the publishing world. So it was almost a la Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Well, all of my friends were moving to the Lower East Side, which is now this chic neighborhood of bars and boutiques, or to Brooklyn, which I call the left bank. Well, I took a different turn. I rented a room in a rather eccentric woman's apartment on the city's Upper West Side. It was Riverside and 82nd Street. And I remember that first day I came to the apartment building, and the lobby was red marble. The doorman brought you up in this mahogany paneled elevator, and the room was affordable. It was painted lavender. I was going to sleep in this antique white iron 4-poster bed, and I thought, I really arrived, you know? This seemed like the beginning of a Woody Allen film. This is how I wanted my New York story to begin. Well, a few weeks go by. Things aren't as charming as they initially seem. They never are if you're living in somebody else's apartment. You know, it's like there's this no men are loud rule. It's me, my landlady, her blind cat, and well, things are a little tense. But not everything is going downhill. I've landed a job at the New York Times, and I'm working as a news clerk by day. And by night, I'm being dispatched to the red carpet. I'm reporting for the paper's celebrity column, and I'm interviewing Clint Eastwood about his love of gardening, Morgan Freeman, Paul Newman, James Gandolfini, aka Tony Soprano, asked me out on a date, which won me the title Bravest Gossip Reporter Ever. Shirley MacLaine sat me down on a couch for about 2 hours trying to convince me of a past life. And I have to tell you, I was almost at the point where I was going to believe her. I mean, I was, as all young people, I think, are, or as all people are, I was searching for love and for a good story and for meaning in my own life. And this all happened in the most unusual way, which is one morning. It was October 6th, 2003. I stepped outside of my apartment building, and parked in front of the awning was this dumpster. And it was rusted, and it was red, and one side was down, and I could see at a glance that there were about 50 old steamer trunks. And each one was riveted in brass, plastered with a vintage travel label from Paris or London, Monaco, these dreamy pictures of ocean liners advertising the French line. And I felt that this was an absolute message in a bottle. It wasn't going to be around for long. So if you can imagine, I'm dressed and late for work, but just find myself grabbing that dumpster's grimy edge, pulling myself up, suspending my rational self for a few minutes, which turned out to be an entire day, excavating this site, and all of a sudden balancing about 6 trunks deep, wondering when I had my last tetanus shot as I start excavating. And each trunk, probably many of you had one of these trunks, or your parents had one. One side was fitted with drawers, the other with hangers, and I found a flapper dress, which I now wear. I found this stunning coat from Bergdorf's, which was tangerine boucle with an iridescent silk lining and a single Bakelite button, which only needed a trip to the dry cleaner. There was an entire collection of vintage handbags, a lucite box purse, a beaded scaled evening bag, and within each, really, a time capsule or a Cornell box. There were Mahjong booklets. There were matchboxes from Schraft. There was a lipstick by Revlon in a shade called Bachelor's Carnation. There were little crumbled to-do lists written in a woman's delicate hand which said, piano tuned, carpets down, pick up bra from Saks. And I just got this absolute whiff of the past and of how life was lived among a certain set in the 20s and the 30s. But the real treasure to emerge from this virtual urban shipwreck was this crumbling red leather diary kept by a young woman named Florence Wolfson from 1929 to 1934, between the ages of 14 and 19. And I brought it upstairs with me that evening and sat down on my bed. My landlady wasn't so thrilled about the 3 trunks I dragged in, promising to polish them until they looked like their cousins at Louis Vuitton. But I found myself absolutely transported into this young woman's world from the 30s. And I'm going to read to you from her diary. Its nearly 2,000 entries painted a portrait of a teenager obsessed with her appearance and the meaning of her existence. Meeting friends for tea at Schraft's, nightclubbing at El Morocco, dancing at the Hotel Pennsylvania, the New Yorker Hotel, and the Savoy Ballroom. January 16th, 1930. I bought a pair of patent leather opera pumps with real high heels. April 20th, 1931. Dyed my eyebrows and eyelashes, and I've absolutely ruined my face. Observations about frivolous matters were interspersed with heartfelt reflections about the books she loved. Balzac and Flaubert were particular favorites. August 3rd, 1932. She writes, spent all day reading something of Jane Austen's. How refreshing. How novel. Has her breed died out? And here I am, and we all are living in this age of internet and blogs, and the sort of daily dramas Florence penned in her diary have really migrated online. And I thought, well, I wonder if Florence is still around as I continue to read. She writes on one day, reading Hedda Gabler for the 10th time. I have to say, as I wrote the book, I took on a syllabus of Florence's reading, and I was reading Balzac and Baudelaire, and I only got through Hedda Gabler once. 10 times is quite a feat. Music, a recurring theme, scored her life with exclamation points. Beethoven symphonies, Bach fugues. June 28, 1932. Have stuffed myself with Mozart and Beethoven. I feel like a ripe apricot. I'm dizzy with the exotic. And I thought, I want to feel like a ripe apricot. Don't you? Florence turns to me today at 93 and she says, to be quite honest, I feel more like a potato. The young woman who emerged from the diary's pages had huge ambitions, even if chasing them proved daunting. February 21st, 1931. Went to the Museum of Modern Art and almost passed out from sheer jealousy. I can't even paint an apple yet. It's heartbreaking. And, of course, I was having similar experiences, though it wasn't at the MoMA Florence that perhaps you knew, which opened in 1929 in the Heckscher building on the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street. Here, this 15-year-old's comparing herself to Cézanne. She also spent her afternoons at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when she described it as being a virtually solitary experience. And after classes at Hunter, she would wander through its galleries without hardly seeing a soul. Here she writes, I couldn't study today and went to the museum to pass a morning of agonizing beauty, blown glass, jade, and exquisite embroideries. While she's writing in her diary, she's also writing short stories on a lavender Remington typewriter with French accents that she sent away for. She had serious literary ambitions. At 15, Florence writes, I'm working on a novel. You didn't know I was working on one, did you? but what adolescent is an adolescent without a novel? And I thought, so true. And here, Florence, I found your book. One entry in particular really spoke to, I think, the whole beauty of this story. Florence writes, "Wrote all day, and my story is still incomplete." And I had this feeling of how magical it was that as a young writer, I had found this other young writer's book where she had left off 75 years ago. And I felt that it was up to me to sort of join our stories and see where Florence's story led. What she craved most was to be enveloped in a grand passion that would transform her life. July 3rd, 1932, Florence writes, 5 hours of tennis and glorious happiness. All I want is someone to love. I feel incomplete. Well, we were certainly on parallel paths. Now, first I thought I had found the diary of a nice Jewish daughter. Florence was jaunting through Central Park on horseback. She was playing piano and tennis. At a certain point, I stumbled upon the entry, April 11th, 1932. Slept with Pearl tonight. It was beautiful. There is nothing so gratifying as physical intimacy with one you like. And I thought, wow, Florence, she was much more adventurous than I initially thought and really unbuttoned my whole notion of a 1930s girl. Well, over the next 3 years, I found myself following Florence's adventures as I made my way through her 2,000 entries. I read about her obsession with the famous stage actress, Eva Le Gallienne. How many people are familiar with Eva Le Gallienne here? Oh, good. Sometimes I speak to, my contemporaries and nobody knows who she is. But Eva Le Gallienne ran the Civic Repertory Theater on 14th Street. She put on productions of Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, and Hedda Gabler, thus Florence reading it 10 times. And Florence felt that she was meant to know Eva, much as I felt that I was meant to know Florence. And she wrote to the actress. She got no response. Went to a production of Peter Pan, and Eva would fly over the audience in this emerald leotard suspended by an invisible fishing wire. It must have been quite a sensation sitting there. I wish we could replicate it tonight. And afterwards, she goes up to an usher, and she had drawn a portrait of the artist, the actress, and she said, "Give this to Miss Le Gallienne. Tell her I want to see her." And she's 15, but she's dyed her hair blonde from sneaking a bottle of peroxide from her father's medical office, which was in their apartment on 96th and Madison. Her mother, who started out as a seamstress on the Lower East Side, would eventually own a couture dress shop on Madison Avenue. So she had these beautiful clothes. And Florence is brought backstage to see the actress. And she gets there, and Eva's sitting at her vanity, surrounded by her powder puffs and rouges. And Florence just sort of breathlessly says, "Thank you so much for seeing me. I love you." And the actress starts laughing, and she says, "But my dear, you're a baby." And she invited her to join her very prestigious acting troupe at the time. But Florence said she went home, told her father. Her father absolutely blew up. There was no way she was going to go trooping off and quit college and become an actress. So that was the conclusion of that cameo. But I mention it because it was one of the thousands of cameos and insights I had into this rather extraordinary, ordinary life. I followed Florence's trips every summer to the Catskills. At 13, she first met one of, who she described, one of 8 beautiful brothers built like Greek gods who worked their family's farm, which was a small retreat called Spring Lake. Later on the eve of her 24th birthday, she would marry this young man, young Greek god named Nat Howitt. Interesting to note is the New York Times has compared Florence to a Marjorie Morningstar before Herman Wouk graduated from college. And the oldest of the 8 brothers opened up a new hotel which, unlike the one he had grown up on, was not kosher. No kids were allowed. It was called South Wind, and of course it's also the name of the hotel where Marjorie meets Noel Airman, if you recall. Well, Florence grew up in a brownstone in Harlem. She went to the first all-women's public high school in New York. It was called Wadley. The girls were known as the Owlettes, after their mascot. You went to Wadley? Well, I visited Wadley. Wadley is still around. It's on 114th Street. It has these beautiful stained glass panels in the lobby, one which is this young, almost goddess-looking like girl with a big key around her neck, which, of course, when I found the diary, I thought, another symbol, a key. Among, actually, Wadley's ranks are Anais Nin, the prolific diarist, went there, Lillian Hellman, Jean Stapleton. Afterwards, Florence wanted to go to Barnard, but she showed up to her interview wearing a suit and tie a la Eva Le Gallienne. And as you'll read about, this did not go over that well. And a few weeks later, she got in the mail a rejection that said, "Too brilliant an individual." So it was off to Hunter, which was better. It was the Depression. And Florence joined ranks of many Jewish women who were trying to sort of carve out a life for themselves. She was the editor-in-chief of the literary journal called Echo, and on her staff was a young woman named Joy Davidman, a girl from the Bronx who would later marry C.S. Lewis. Also a young woman named Belle Kaufman, who is the granddaughter of Shalom Aleichem and the author of Up the Down Staircase. Then it was off to Columbia for Florence. And while she was at Columbia, she set about doing something very unusual for the time, which was to start a literary salon. And she invited young poets and writers from the campus to come to her home, and she served them white wine, and she would later remember bending down to light the fireplace, and as she did, she would unpin her long blonde hair and let it cascade down her shoulders as her members debated the poetics of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. And Florence today turns to me and she says, "Does anybody read philosophy anymore? Do they talk about it?" And I told her, well, you're going to inspire them too. But among her salon was a young man named Delmore Schwartz, one of the preeminent poets of his generation, and another poet named John Berryman, who would later win the Pulitzer Prize for his work Dream Songs. Well, I had the diary for 3 years, and it slept in my bedside table drawer, and it was something I came back to again and again, and as I walked around New York in that Bergdorf's coat, I visited all the places Florence wrote about, and I wondered what had happened to this young woman who seemed so bent on transforming the world around her, and how did she disappear into history? And I felt that there were probably many Florences. And at the New York Times, I had moved away from doing celebrity reporting, and I was writing all sorts of features about the city's hidden treasures. And I wrote about the Proust Society. I wrote about a Finnegan's Wake Society, about Manhattan's last typewriter repairman. This story in particular was very interesting to me. He worked in the Flatiron Building. His office was filled with these crammed machines. And the day the story ran, I received a phone call out of the blue from a private investigator. And he said he was also a lover of old New York, and he had read the article, and it had really almost brought a tear to his eye. And so we start talking. He says he's old school, I think is how he put it. And he said he prefers not to talk over the phone. Could we meet for lunch? So I thought, well, I haven't met a private eye before, besides, watching The Big Sleep. And, let's give it a go. Maybe it'll be an interesting story. So he picked the place. It's Keen's Chop House in Midtown. And on a snowy March afternoon, 3 years after I found the diary, I meet him. And Charlie, that's the private eye's name, he shows up. and he's wearing a trench coat, and his license plate is Sleuth 3. And as we sit down to look at the menu, he pulls a magnifying glass out of his pocket, and I start giving a face, and I said, are you for real? And he starts laughing. He says, oh, yeah, this is just because I forgot my glasses at home. I said, okay, whatever, sure, But I pulled the diary out of my bag, and I put it on a cloth napkin, because by this time it's really crumbling. And I tell him the story that I've just shared with you. And he was absolutely entranced by Florence. Of course, she was sort of a femme fatale. And he looked at me and he just said, wouldn't it be incredible, Lily, if we could find her heirs? Well, I had been on this personal quest to find Florence for the last 3 years. But by searching New York City's birth records and using this collection of vintage telephone books that Charlie has. He has about 1,000 that he keeps in Tupperware in his Long Island home. He found 3 Florence Wolfsons who were born in 1915. I knew this was the year she was born because within the diary, the only clipping I had to her identity was this piece of newspaper that had said in Yiddish and in English that Florence Wolfson had won the Regents Scholarship at 15, and it gave her address. And by triangulating all this info, he found the 3 Florence Wolfsons. 2 were no longer alive, 1 still was, and he eventually led me to Florence Howitt, a 90-year-old woman living with her husband of 67 years, right around the corner in Pompano Beach, Florida. Now, I vividly remember that Sunday that I was handed her number, and I pick up my cell phone and I call her. But actually, before I pushed send, I thought, well, have I gone a little too far in my voyeuristic glimpse into this young woman's life? I mean, I really felt like I knew Florence, and all these names sprinkled through the pages, Manny and George and Nat and Pearl and this mysterious young woman named M. Well, I felt I knew them too. But then again, I thought if Florence was anything like that free-spirited young woman I had come to know and love, that she would want to hear from me. So Florence picks up. She has the voice of an old stage actress. I start describing to her the serendipitous chain of events that's led me to her, and she's absolutely stunned. She said, did you know I was a writer? And I said, well, of course, from reading your diary, Florence, I did. And she just said, who are you that you've searched me out of the universe? And she said, I have to meet you. And that's how I felt. So a month later, she lives in Westport, Connecticut during the summer. I took the train to go see her from Grand Central. And it really seemed like the perfect stage set for this final leg of the journey under the constellation-painted ceiling, past the old information booth, which at Florence's time you could ask any question of, regardless of train timetables, where to get a bite to eat, where to get those opera pumps, or a copy of Hedda Gabler, I guess. Well, I go to Westport, and one of Florence's daughters picks me up at the train station. We go along these winding roads to Florence's house and walk in, and Florence is unexpectedly glamorous. She's sitting in her leather Eames chair by the window, a little dab of red lipstick, and she held out her arms to me and hugged me, and I handed her the diary. And it was really an incredible moment that she writes about in the foreword to the book. She just says, what does it feel like when a forgotten chunk of your life is handed back to you? And she said, it stopped my heart for a moment. And as she was paging through these brittle leaves, I really had the sensation that I had brought this young woman of the diary's pages to meet her 90-year-old self. And she began telling me her story. And although I'd had these 2,000 entries to work from, and I think it really speaks to the power of the written word that I was able to glean so much, there were still many questions I had for Florence. First of all, her parents. I said, Florence, when I first read this, it was like a Sex in the City of the 30s, I mean, did you have a curfew? Well, she talked about her parents. Both were from long lines of rabbis. Both had come to the country around 1906. Her mother was a twin. Actually, the family in Lithuania only had the money to send one of the daughters over. And after she arrived, the whole family was killed in a pogrom. Her mother, though, started out as a seamstress. She would eventually own her own dress company, really support her family through the Depression. While Florence's father was a physician, he would treat patients for $1 or less, and her mother was really the breadwinner. But in turn, the parents really didn't get along, and so the diary took on even more resonance. I mean, this was one of the few places Florence really had to confide in and to sort of figure out her life and who she was and who she was going to become. She told me about this incredible whirlwind trip to Europe in 1936. All of the members of the Salon were in a race to get to Europe. As Florence said, it was a beacon, and as a young artist, I wanted to be a part of it. And she pulled out these incredible photos, one of a dashing young man. She told me his name, Filippo Canaletti Gaudente da Sirollo. He was an Italian count, a poet and a pilot who wrote love verses to her. I turned to her and I said, Florence, this is becoming Titanic, and she laughed. But there was a bittersweet moment to the reunion, which is, Florence said, from reading about that young woman in the diary's pages, how did I end up living this ordinary life? And she turned to me and she said, have I been a disappointment to you? And I said, not at all. And she hadn't. Not in my wildest dreams did I imagine that Florence at 90 would sort of be so open and willing to bring a stranger into her life. She writes about in the foreword just how did she feel about all these intimate moments and thoughts being on public display. And she said the young Florence would have said, go for it. And that's really who she still is today. And this book and this journey, which is continuing, and now I feel that all of you just being here and listening to the story are a part of it, has really opened up this incredible second chapter for Florence and for myself. Florence got a laptop again, and she's writing. From once reporting on celebrities for the New York Times, Florence has become a celebrity in her own right. We were on the Today Show together in Good Morning America. And at a certain point, Florence turned to me and she said, Lily, my life was a tragedy before you came along. I said, oh, come on, Florence, And she said, yeah, but now it's a romantic comedy. And she hopes Meryl Streep's going to play her in the movie. She keeps on saying, well, I'm going to stay alive until the movie comes out. But her daughter, it's really changed the whole family dynamic. Her daughters just said they've learned so much about her. Not only these risque details, but they've just been able to see her as this young, passionate woman searching for love. And Florence said, I no longer feel like an ordinary old woman. People look at me in a different way. And her grandchildren think she's cool. In fact, Florence said her daughters even treat her better than they ever have before. And like I said, it's just been a real fairy tale. So I'm going to pause here. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience. And I'm happy to take any questions.
What you're doing now is bringing yesterday's history to be known for the children of the following century. That's what you're doing by doing what you're doing.
Well, it's been totally enthralling for me. I think sometimes writing can be sort of a lonely profession, And instead of just being there in my isolated room where I work, I was suddenly able to access through this portal of this diary, this different world. And it's a world that I really long for. You know, things are just speeding up and everyone's on their Blackberries and their iPhones. And when I thought about taking a 10-day trip to get to Europe, just being able to have the luxury to think about your life, you know, that was very enticing to me. And Florence would describe riding on the top deck of the Fifth Avenue bus and staring into the apartments, or we found pictures of these old Mercury statuettes that used to decorate the light posts down Fifth Avenue. And, God, I feel like I almost lived in the 1930s. I feel like I was a hunter girl. I went through their yearbooks and all these names, Pearl and Marjorie and Miriam, all these girls with their marcelled hair and matching V-necks. I just, you know, I'm entranced.
It's a pleasure and a delight to hear you speak. Your words are evocative of such wonderful pictures. Has your book been optioned for a movie?
Not yet, but we're working on it.
It sounds like it would be wonderful.
It would be. It would be like a Titanic, but kind of sexier. Yeah.
First, is the Red Leather Diary still, is it kept in Tupperware? Where is it? And then I wanted to just share, I had checked the book out of the library, and I left it on an airplane. And you found Florence's diary, so I was hoping that somebody would find your diary. And it never got found.
Oh, really?
Where is it?
Well, at least it's out in the world circulating. The actual Red Leather Diary, which looks just like the hardcover copy, though the paperback has a whole new section where Florence even updates her diary today, which is really cool. The actual diary has become a family heirloom, and it was always my intention to return it to Florence, and it is hers and her family's. Though we recently heard from Columbia University that they would like it for their rare manuscripts division as a feminist text. So it will probably go there.
Was the trunk that you found the diary in, was that Florence's trunk?
Yeah, it was Florence's trunk. I mean, there were 50, maybe more steamer trunks, and these were all different people who had lived at 98 Riverside Drive over the years. Florence and her husband, when they moved out in the late 80s, left behind this one trunk in the basement. I think they figured they hadn't been into it in decades. There was probably nothing in it, though there was the diary, there was her Columbia master's thesis on this poet. There was an autographed picture from the actress Eva Le Gallienne, and there was a Western Union telegram which just said, "I love you, Nat." And I remember when I first met Florence, her husband was still alive, and he was 95, but he was sort of deteriorating. And I handed Florence the diary and Nat this telegram. And she later said that almost even more important than reclaiming her diary was this telegram, which just really reminded her of the love between her and her husband. She described him as sort of Gary Cooper-like, taciturn, cowboyish in his good looks. And people actually often ask me about, well, how did she end up with Nat? Now as a dentist, he would later become an oral surgeon. They say, Florence was such an avant-garde young woman. Well, the story goes, on the eve of her 24th birthday, Florence and Nat proposed to Florence. She accepted, though Florence's mother was not thrilled. Nat wasn't a doctor. She had been sending Florence to the Catskills since she was about 13 to meet this nice Jewish doctor. So they eloped. They drove to Mexico City for their honeymoon. afterwards, Florence wrote hundreds of these very edgy, feminist-tinged articles, or articles like what to do with the unmarried daughter, or how to behave in public without an escort, or how to quarrel with your husband. But they were married for 75 years, and it was a real heartbreak to Florence when he died. But she described them as, I think the most beautiful description was, she said, we were like ballet dancers, and he was the support.
Did her family know anything about any of her lives previously? Did her husband know about any of her other love affairs?
Yeah, it wasn't anything that Florence kept secret. I mean, there are several parts in the diary where her mother finds out that these friendships with girls have grown into something a little bit more, and she says this is going to be detrimental to the rest of your life. And Florence really doesn't seem all that concerned. You know, this is really part of her artistic and intellectual exploration, and she was someone. What made her such an interesting character, and why I was so drawn to her, I think, was just she had this fearless inward gaze, and she was just committed to carving out a path of her own. But her daughters had heard a little bit about it, but I think what the book, which is really an amalgam of memoir and biography, has shown them is just it's like looking at a photograph of somebody and suddenly realizing, getting that moment, wow, this person was young, they were like me, and this whole world has just been revealed to them, instead of like hearing bits and pieces over dinner about different stories. So I think it's something everybody deserves, and hopefully their families do it for them, or their friends, or they share their own story.
Has she become less or a recluse now, and if so, what is she doing?
Well, Florence, she's 93. We've been touring all over together. She actually hoped she could be here tonight, though sometimes she gets quite tired and she just wasn't feeling up to it. We're going for a very early TV interview tomorrow. So she's had this sort of diva-like schedule for the last several months since the book has come out. But she's actually writing again. She wrote the foreword to the book. She said to me, Lily, I haven't written for so long, I don't know if I can do it. And then I said, well, don't worry about it. We'll edit it, we'll work it out. And she handed me a first draft, which literally ran as she handed it to me, exactly, in the book.
Become a Book of Life fan on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com and listen to the latest episode by phone at 916-313-3820. And of course, find links to everything at bookoflifepodcast.com. The Book of Life is a podcast service of Congregation B'nai Israel of Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries, online at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers at freilachmakers.com. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.